In this episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan is joined by guest Alex Berenson. The conversation covers a wide range of topics, including the pharmaceutical industry, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the intersection of money in medicine. The discussion begins with a focus on the pharmaceutical industry and its practices. Berenson highlights the ways in which drug companies often prioritize profits over the well-being of patients. He explains how these companies manipulate studies and use friendly doctors to promote their products. Berenson also discusses the financial incentives that doctors receive for prescribing certain drugs, which can lead to overprescribing and unnecessary medical procedures. The conversation then shifts to the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it. Berenson criticizes the government and health officials for not emphasizing the importance of personal health and immune system support. He argues that taking care of one's health, including proper nutrition and supplementation, should be the primary message during the pandemic. Berenson also discusses the role of social media in exacerbating the division and polarization surrounding COVID-19, as well as the dangers of excessive screen time and online arguments. The discussion delves into the topic of drug legalization and its consequences. Berenson uses the example of gambling to illustrate how legalizing and normalizing certain activities can lead to more people engaging in them, including those who may not have done so otherwise. He argues that while personal freedom is important, there should be limits and regulations in place to prevent the negative consequences of these activities. The conversation then turns to the role of incentives in the medical field. Berenson highlights the financial incentives that exist for doctors and hospitals, such as receiving payments for COVID-19 cases and deaths. He argues that these incentives can lead to mislabeling and overreporting of COVID-19 cases and deaths, which can skew data and perpetuate fear surrounding the pandemic. Berenson also discusses the limitations of modern medicine and the importance of addressing basic health needs, such as clean water and sanitation. He argues that while medical advancements have been significant, there are limits to what medicine can achieve, especially in terms of extending life expectancy. He suggests that focusing on basic health measures and prevention may be more effective in improving overall health outcomes. The conversation continues with a discussion on the origins of the COVID-19 virus. Berenson suggests that it likely originated from a lab, either through accidental release or intentional manipulation. He criticizes the lack of outrage and investigation surrounding this possibility and emphasizes the need for transparency and accountability in scientific research. Berenson continues by expressing his skepticism towards the effectiveness of the mRNA vaccines and argues that they should be stopped due to their potential long-term effects. He questions the accuracy of predictions made by experts and highlights the need for more research on the vaccine's efficacy and safety. The discussion then shifts to the topic of UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Berenson shares his doubts about the existence of aliens and questions the credibility of UFO sightings and crash retrieval programs. He suggests that the focus should be on understanding and addressing the threats posed by viruses rather than searching for extraterrestrial life. The conversation takes a critical turn as Berenson discusses the development and marketing of vaccines. He argues that the pharmaceutical industry prioritizes profits over public health and criticizes the lack of transparency and accountability in the vaccine approval process. He also highlights the financial gains made by pharmaceutical companies through the sale of vaccines. Berenson reveals that he is currently suing the government, as well as the CEO and board members of Pfizer, over their handling of the pandemic and the vaccines. He accuses them of misleading the public and profiting from the vaccines. The discussion then delves into the topic of vaccine mandates. Berenson argues that the mandates are unnecessary and infringe upon individual autonomy. He questions the logic behind mandating vaccines for healthy adults in the workforce, rather than focusing on protecting those who are at higher risk from COVID-19. Rogan and Berenson also discuss the issue of natural immunity and its dismissal by health authorities. They highlight the importance of considering natural immunity in the context of vaccination strategies. The conversation continues with a discussion on the media's portrayal of vaccine-related issues. Berenson criticizes the media for its biased reporting and failure to acknowledge alternative viewpoints. He argues that the media's portrayal of vaccine skeptics as conspiracy theorists is unfair and hinders open and honest dialogue. Berenson emphasizes the importance of avoiding categorization and embracing the variability within political ideologies. He argues that the extreme views and actions of a few individuals should not be representative of an entire group. He criticizes the tendency to label individuals based on their agreement with certain ideas, which can lead to unfair assumptions and judgments. The discussion then shifts to the topic of freedom of speech and the growing trend of limiting it. Berenson highlights a poll that shows a significant percentage of Democrats supporting the government's ability to ban false speech on social media. He expresses concern over the erosion of free speech and the shift in liberal attitudes towards it, citing historical examples of liberals defending the rights of individuals with opposing views. The conversation delves into the topic of drug legalization, with a focus on the potential consequences of legalizing all drugs. Berenson acknowledges the arguments for regulation and harm reduction, but also raises concerns about the impact on addiction rates, public safety, and parenting. He questions whether complete drug legalization would lead to more people trying drugs and the potential for increased addiction and negative outcomes. The discussion then touches on the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs. Berenson mentions recent research that suggests these programs may not be effective and could even have negative consequences. He argues that the focus should be on creating a more equal starting line for individuals rather than solely addressing the consequences of inequality. The conversation briefly touches on climate change, with Berenson highlighting the need to consider the actions of other countries, such as China and India, in addition to focusing on domestic efforts. He questions the effectiveness of solely focusing on reducing carbon emissions in the United States and Europe when other countries continue to build coal-fired plants. The podcast continues with a discussion on the impact of fear-based messaging on adolescents, particularly in relation to climate change. Berenson argues against scaring children and emphasizes the importance of providing a balanced perspective that acknowledges the impact of human activity on the environment without instilling unnecessary fear. The discussion continues with a light-hearted conversation about aliens and the possibility of their existence. Berenson mentions CIA documents that suggest the presence of different alien races visiting Earth. They also discussed the idea of hallucinations and dreams playing a role in alien abduction stories. The conversation then shifts to the state of journalism and the media's coverage of Donald Trump. Berenson reflects on his time at the New York Times and how the media's perception of Trump changed after he was elected. They discuss the polarization of the left and right and the dangers of silencing opposing viewpoints. Berenson then talks about his ongoing legal battle with Twitter and the government. He filed a lawsuit against Twitter for banning him from the platform, claiming that it violated his First Amendment rights. He also discusses the Missouri v. Biden case, which challenges the government's influence on social media censorship. The conversation touches on the power dynamics between the government and social media companies. They discuss the definition of misinformation and malinformation and the implications of regulating social media platforms. They also mention the role of advertisers in influencing content moderation. The discussion then turns to the 2024 presidential election and potential candidates. They speculate on who the Democrats might run if Joe Biden is unable to run for re-election. They mention Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer as possible candidates, but note that it is still early to predict. They briefly discuss Ron DeSantis and his handling of COVID-19 in Florida. While they acknowledge his competence, they question his popularity and ability to defeat Trump in a primary election. The conversation continues with a discussion about Trump's magnetism and his appeal to a significant portion of the population. They reflect on the dissatisfaction with the current administration and the belief among some that the 2020 election was rigged. The conversation then shifts to vaccine mandates and the erosion of personal freedoms. Berenson argues that vaccine mandates are unnecessary and infringe upon individual rights. He believes that natural immunity should be taken into account and that people should have the freedom to make their own decisions about vaccination. The discussion then turns to the topic of election fraud and the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Berenson acknowledges that while there may have been some unfairness and bias in the media against former President Donald Trump, he does not believe that the election was manipulated or that votes were stolen. He criticizes the spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation surrounding the election, particularly regarding Dominion voting machines. Berenson also highlights the need for a more secure and transparent election system, suggesting that voter ID requirements should not be considered racist. He references a documentary from the early 90s called Hacking Democracy, that exposed vulnerabilities in voting machines and emphasizes the importance of ensuring the integrity of elections. The conversation then touches on the January 6 Capitol riot. Both Rogan and Berenson agree that the sentences handed out to some of the participants are excessive, but they also condemn the actions of those involved. They discuss the lack of security and the decision by law enforcement to back off when the Capitol was breached. They also criticized the individuals who participated in the riot, highlighting the dangers of mob mentality and the consequences of their actions. The podcast concludes with a discussion about the polarization of the country and the need for leaders who are respected and have the best interests of the country in mind. They express concerns about the potential for further unrest and violence, regardless of the outcome of future elections. They also touch on other topics such as climate change, the state of public health, and the importance of exercise and vitamin intake. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe.